This is Hollow Knight. Despite being made by primarily 3 people and having a super rush development, with almost nothing being cut out of the game, it still managed to change Metroidvania games forever. In the 2010s, the mainstays of the genre were left dormant. Nintendo spent a decade and a half making Metroid Dread, and left us fans waiting for a 4th entry in the Prime series, whilst making spin-offs and remakes in the meantime. Konami, on the other hand, had published what seems to be the last Castlevania game in 2014. However, with the lack of Konami and Nintendo, this left a path for other studios to make their own Metroidvanias. We got games like Dead Cells, Blasphemous, and Ori, but out of all of the Metroidvanias released in this time, Hollow Knight made the greatest impact out of all of them. In Hollow Knight, you play as a little bug who doesn't have a name, but the community calls him the Knight, so that's his name now. You start with a nail and 5 masks, which act as hearts, and a circle that fills up every time you attack an enemy. This is called Soul, and the player can use this soul to heal. Healing takes a long time to execute. This leads to combat being very engaging. When healing, the Knight is more vulnerable than a fish swimming in front of a shark, as the Knight can't move. Normally, when the Knight is not healing, they can move relatively fast and can be made even faster later in the game when you get upgrades such as the Mothwind Cloak. What I find most interesting about Hollow Knight's combat is what it's inspired of. Whilst it obviously takes inspiration from Dark Souls, it also takes inspiration from Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. The reason why I find this interesting is because I actually think Zelda 2 is a horrible game and almost unplayable in its current state. However, there are a lot of mechanics in Zelda 2 that could have been very fun if it was implemented in a better way. For example, one of the mechanics that Hollow Knight takes from Zelda 2 is pogoing. In Zelda 2, you could perform this by simply holding down when jumping above an enemy. Here, it didn't require much skill as you could trivialize some enemies just by holding down. But in Hollow Knight, you must time a button input so that the Knight pogos when you want the Knight to do so. Pogos can also be used in platforming to avoid damage from spikes, and in many areas of the game you are rewarded for using this mechanic for platforming. When you first start the game, you can get the Fury of the Fallen charm by performing a couple pogos here. Hollow Knight's combat system is very fun because it takes aspects from other games and fuses them together to make something completely new. Take the fast-paced dodging but slow healing from Dark Souls, make it 2D, and add abilities like the pogo, spells, and weapon arts, and now we have a combat system that is both engaging and rewarding. The main hub world in this game is Dirtmouth. When you first get here, the population is one bug named the Elder Bug. Whilst there isn't much to do here at the start of the game, later shops open here and let you buy things such as maps, if you miss the chance to from Conifer. Now from here, the left path brings you back to the tutorial of the game, where there is some new content that hasn't been explored. However, it is only accessible once you get the Mantis Claw. The path on the right leads back to a locked door that you need a key to open. The only option is to go down. That is a common theme in this game. Instead of your typical side-scroller where you either go left or right, instead in this game you mainly go down. In fact, every area in the entire game is below Dirtmouth except the Howling Cliffs, King's Pass, and part of the Crystal Peak. Once you enter the Forgotten Crossroads, you can now either go left or right. What I like about this is the fact that both options are the right way. Both paths lead to the first boss of the game. They differ in the rewards they give you. On the left path you can get the map, meet the Grubfather, and see an area that you can't access yet but might want to keep in mind for later. On the right there are more enemies to fight, giving you more geo and more grubs to collect. I like this because instead of forcing the player into figuring out where to go, the game can slowly ease the player into doing that. Once you beat the 4th Knight, you can get a spell called the Vengeful Spirit. Now combat changes as Soul can be used as a defensive tool as well as an offensive tool. This rewards the player for not getting hit, as you can use your soul for doing damage instead of healing. Continuing up this area, you find this enemy who you defeat by hitting him with spells and attacking these smaller enemies when you run out of soul. But wait, did you notice that? That enemy looks awfully familiar. Well, if you remember to earlier, you couldn't get here without your Vengeful Spirit spell, but now you can. The game is now starting to leave you on your own and forces you to find this area. Now you enter Green Path and you keep seeing Hornet jump away from you. One thing I like about Hollow Knight is how many skips you can make. When designing the game, Team Cherry wanted players to use mechanics to skip certain sections of the game in a Super Metroid style. In this part, Hornet jumps just out of reach, but if you lure this enemy to where Hornet jumped, you can pogo off it to skip a huge section of Green Path. Once you catch Hornet, it is revealed that she is a boss fight. She isn't too hard even for new players, but she makes sure that you can react fast enough for some of the later fights in this game. Once you defeat her, you are rewarded with the Mothwing Cloak, which is a dash ability. Now you can go through the Fog Canyon and use the Mothwing Cloak here in Queen Station to get to the Fungal Waste. The first time I played this game, I thought this was the only way you could get here, but I was wrong. You can also get here from the Forgotten Crossroads by dashing here. A lot of areas in Hollow Knight have multiple entries, which makes it easy to backtrack and easy to find your way into different areas. Now after the game makes sure you know how to pogo and you go past these mantises, you can get the Mantis Claw. Since the start of the game, the player has been guided in a very linear way. The game first makes you comfortable by making both paths lead to the right location. It then steps it up a notch by making you remember a location and realizing that you can travel there after getting a spell. And finally, it makes you explore the whole map to find where to use the dash ability. Now once you get the Mantis Claw, the game stops holding your hand. I might be missing some, but you can go to the City of Tears, Deep Nest, the Howling Cliffs, the Royal Waterways if you have a simple key, the Ancient Basin, the Crystal Peak, the Resting Grounds, and finally if you get the Trampast in Deep Nest, you can also go to the Kingdom's Edge. With this many areas to explore, it might be a bit confusing on where to go. To progress, you need to get the Dream Nail in the Resting Grounds. However, this doesn't mean exploring other areas isn't useful. On top of getting upgrades to your health, nail, and spells, you can also get spells like the Desolate Dive, and abilities like the Crystal Heart, Isma's Tear, and the Monarch Wings, among others. Some abilities are required to beat the game, so exploring these areas is well worth your time. Once you get the Dream Nail, you are tasked to find 3 Dreamers. Once you find all 3, you can go back to the Black Egg Temple and fight the Hollow Knight to beat the game. You can find the Dreamers in any order, but I'll just explain them in a random order. Lurien the Watcher is found in the upper level of the City of Tears. The enemies on the lower level are a lot weaker as they are made to be fought with a low level nail, as pale ore is very scarce in the early game. However, on the higher level there are these enemies that have a shield and do 2 masks of damage per attack. This makes getting to Lurien hard, but even harder is the boss before Lurien, known as the Watcher Knight. One of the hardest parts of a Souls-like game in terms of designing it is making fights where multiple enemies attack you at once. To make a boss like this fair, you would have to make sure that the bosses work together instead of having them work independently like this. Team Cherry did this right with the Mantis Lords as they only attack one after another, but the Watcher Knights don't do this. They move independently, meaning that if you see an opening to attack the boss, it might not actually be a good opening. What's even worse is when you consider how long it takes to heal in this game, it can be really annoying when you think you can heal, but the other Watcher Knight just pops out of nowhere. They do have very little health, however there are 6 of them, with a maximum of 2 fighting at once. You can make this easier by dropping a chandelier on one to make it so that there are 5, however this doesn't change the fact that the boss is designed poorly. Hera the Beast is found at the very end of the treacherous paths of Deep Nest. To get into Deep Nest you could either fight the Mantis Lords, or you could find the secret entrance. This is another place where Hollow Knight makes it easy to find crucial areas, as it has 2 entrances instead of 1. Deep Nest is a very creepy place. There are spiders everywhere, it is dark, confusing, and it sounds like this. Just getting through this place is annoying. It It is supposed to be a harder area, and it is also supposed to give vibes of isolation. And in this aspect it does exactly that. Unlike the other two dreamers, there is no boss guarding Hera. Instead, she is in the distant village, where these bugs lure you into sitting on a bench and then transport you to the beast's den in the creepiest way possible. This area is tough as there are these enemies that are really annoying and do 2 marks of damage per attack. It is also dark and confusing, which turns this area into a maze level. Monomon the teacher is probably the most underwhelming of the dreamers. She is found in the teacher's archives in the Fog Canyon. The Fog Canyon is one of the more emptier areas of the game with not much to do other than explore the teacher's archive. The boss is Umu, which is quite boring to fight, because all you do is run around dodging these electric attacks and wait for Quirrell to attack so that you can get some damage in. This was fixed in the Godhome version of the fight, but it did not change the base game version. Once you dream nail all 3 dreamers, you can fight the final boss of the game, the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight is one of my favorite bosses, as in lore the Hollow Knight is the player's sibling and was made to contain the infection that is plaguing Hallownest. This leads to the Hollow Knight being completely corrupted by the infection. At some point in the fight, the Hollow Knight stabs themselves. These are moments where the Hollow Knight gains back control of their body and helps the Knight seal the infection. The boss also moves like it has been corrupted. The Hollow Knight swings its sword around aimlessly, spews out the infection, and flails around. It seems to be a well-trained knight who has been completely taken over by the infection and lost all skills that they once had. The Hollow Knight knows that it needs to sacrifice itself. It needs to let you take the spot as the new Hollow Knight. But you know how I said it was the final boss? Well, it actually isn't, because there is another ending that requires you to fight a different boss. If you double jump here in the Kingdom's Edge and fight Hornet for the 2nd time, you can get the King's Brand. Now you can enter the Abyss through the Ancient Basin. Descending all the way down, you can get the Shade Cloak, which is required for the true ending. Now this upgrade can be used here to get into the Queen's Garden and fight the Trader Lord. The Trader Lord used to be one of the Mantis Lords, however he betrayed them and started using the infection. This boss makes use of the Shade Cloak. Basically every attack can be evaded with the Shade Cloak, so managing the recharge time is the real challenge here. Using the Sharp Shadow Charm can make this easier, as you can do damage with every dash. After beating him, you can talk to the White Lady and get half of the King's Soul. Now if you have the Awoken Dream Nail, you can Dream Nail this guy to get into the White Palace, which is a hard platforming level. After you inevitably spend too much time beating this damn level, you can get the other half of the King's Soul. Now finally, after you Dream Nail your own egg and get the Void Heart, you can fight the true final boss. When you get the Hollow Knight to low HP, you now have the option to Dream Nail the boss and fight the Radiance. This boss is the hardest in the base game, requiring you to put your dodging skills to the extreme. The boss does things such as summoning a wall of swords, shooting beams of light, summoning spikes, and shooting beams of light again, but this time you climb towards the boss on tiny platforms. But once you finally beat the Radiance, it is worth it, as you finish the game and get this last cutscene.